Das Team der Alliierten hat die feindliche Flagge erobert.
Winter of Leningrad, the deadly frozen siege. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. More than 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery, stormed across the Soviet frontier. The plan was clear: destroy the Red Army in weeks, capture Moscow before winter, and secure the agricultural and oil-rich territories of the Soviet Union. But beyond these goals, there was one city that carried unique weight: symbolic, strategic, and emotional. Leningrad, the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution. The city named after Lenin himself, the former imperial capital of the Tsars, and a vast industrial powerhouse of the Soviet Union. For Hitler, it was more than just a military objective. It was an ideological prize, a chance to erase the very symbol of communism from the map of Europe. Adolf Hitler said, "Leningrad must vanish from the face of the earth." The German High Command understood the importance of the city. Leningrad housed the massive Kirov factory, producing T-34 tanks, heavy artillery, and weapons that fueled the Red Army. It also stood as the heart of the Soviet Baltic Fleet, a naval threat that Germany could not tolerate. By capturing Leningrad, Hitler hoped to isolate the Soviet North and secure a direct link with his Finnish allies to the north. Together, German and Finnish forces could lock the Soviets in a steel ring, cutting them off permanently. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The fate of Leningrad will show the world what happens to those who oppose the Reich." By September 1941, Army Group North, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Leeb, had closed in. German panzer divisions cut railways, destroyed bridges, and severed the last supply roads. From the north, the Finnish army advanced, pressing ever closer. The city was encircled. 2.5 million civilians, including 400,000 children, were trapped inside the tightening noose. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin raged at the news. He considered the loss of Leningrad unthinkable, both for morale and for the war effort. He demanded the city must be held at all costs. Joseph Stalin said, "We shall not surrender Leningrad. The city will stand, whatever the sacrifice." The orders were brutal but clear. Factories were to continue production under bombardment. Every civilian capable of carrying a shovel was to help build fortifications. And the Red Army would defend every street, every block, every house. Thus began the Siege of Leningrad. A siege not designed to storm the city, but to starve it, to freeze it, to watch it collapse from within. What followed would last for nearly 900 days and claim more lives than almost any other battle of the Second World War. By the end of September 1941, the ring around Leningrad was sealed. No trains entered, no convoys escaped. The city was cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. The only lifeline left was across the vast Lake Ladoga. But as autumn turned to winter, even that became nearly impossible. Inside the city, food supplies dwindled rapidly. Warehouses that stored grain and flour were destroyed by German bombs. The little that remained was rationed, but the rations became smaller and smaller with each passing week. Nikolai Punin, a Soviet art critic trapped inside, wrote in his diary, "We no longer live, we only starve." Every day is the same struggle to find a crust of bread. By November, the bread ration for workers fell to just 250 grams a day. For children and the elderly, it was 125 grams, a slice no bigger than a human hand. And even that bread was not real bread. It was mixed with sawdust, cellulose, even ground bones, anything to stretch the flour. The first winter of the siege was one of the coldest in decades. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Heating fuel was gone. Electricity failed. Water pipes froze solid. Families tore down wooden fences, furniture, even books. Anything that could burn for a few minutes of warmth. Anna Reid later wrote in her book, Leningrad, the Epic Siege of World War II. The people of Leningrad lived like shadows, moving slowly, conserving every step, as hunger consumed their strength. Disease spread quickly: typhus, dysentery, influenza. The hospitals were overcrowded, medicines were scarce, doctors starved alongside their patients. In secret, NKVD reports, later declassified, horrifying notes appeared. Cases of cannibalism began to emerge. At first, the bodies of the dead were used for food. Then, darker crimes followed. An NKVD report recorded, "The population is eating glue, leather, and in some cases, human flesh." Yet despite the hunger, the cold, and the terror, the city refused to surrender. Propaganda posters declared, "Leningrad shall not fall." Radio broadcasts played music, poetry, and patriotic speeches to keep hope alive. And in the darkest of nights, one lifeline remained. Lake Ladoga. When it froze solid, the Soviets created what became known as the Road of Life. Trucks drove across the ice under constant German fire, bringing food in and evacuating some civilians out. It was perilous. Shells exploded around the convoys. Vehicles sank through thin ice. But it was enough. Just enough to keep the city breathing. The first winter had taken hundreds of thousands of lives, but Leningrad still stood. While hunger gnawed at the city and bombs shattered streets daily, something unexpected rose from the ruins. Music. Art became a weapon, a shield of morale, a voice of defiance against the siege. The famous Soviet composer Dmitri Shostakovich had begun writing his 7th symphony in Leningrad itself. He composed as German artillery thundered outside the city. The music was meant to embody resistance, to capture both the suffering and the unbroken will of the people. Dmitri Shostakovich said, "This is not just my symphony. It is the music of our city, of our struggle, of our victory to come." But by late 1941, Shostakovich was evacuated for safety. He completed the symphony elsewhere. But its heart remained tied to Leningrad. In the starving city, the score was delivered secretly through Soviet channels. And in August 1942, with the siege still raging, the Leningrad Radio Orchestra gathered to perform it. There was a problem. The orchestra itself had been decimated by hunger. Musicians had died, or were too weak to play. The conductor, Karl Eliasberg, went through the city, pulling musicians back, sometimes literally from hospital beds. Karl Eliasberg said, "We shall play, even if only one of us remains standing." Rehearsals were grueling. Many musicians collapsed during practice. Some had to be fed with special rations just to have the strength to hold their instruments. And yet, they persevered. On August 9, 1942, the performance began. Loudspeakers carried the music through the ruined streets and even across the German front lines. German soldiers later admitted they heard the notes drifting through the air and realized the city was not dead. A German officer wrote, "When we heard the symphony, we understood. Leningrad would never fall." The 7th Symphony became a symbol, not only of survival, but of defiance. A declaration to the world that even in hunger, cold, and despair, the spirit of Leningrad could not be broken. As winter deepened and death claimed thousands each day, the Soviet command looked desperately for a way to keep the city alive. There was no land corridor, no railway. The Germans had cut every road. Only Lake Ladoga remained, vast, frozen, and deadly. When the ice hardened enough in late 1941, trucks began to roll across its surface. This fragile route became known as the Road of Life. It was the only artery connecting Leningrad with the outside world. General Zhukov said, "Through this road, Leningrad breathes. Without it, the city dies." But the journey was perilous. German artillery targeted the ice. Planes bombed the convoys, and the cold itself was an enemy. Drivers pushed their vehicles forward in darkness, guided by dim lights, listening for the cracks of breaking ice beneath their wheels. Many trucks sank into the black water, dragging food, fuel, and sometimes children with them. Yet others made it through, carrying flour, sugar, and even small amounts of meat into the starving city. On the return trip, they carried out the weak, the elderly, and children. Evacuation under fire, fragile lives carried across a sea of ice. A Soviet driver recalled, "Every trip was a gamble with death. But we knew, if we failed, Leningrad would be lost." Despite unimaginable risks, the Road of Life saved the city from total annihilation. Through it, over 1 million people were evacuated during the siege, and millions of tons of supplies made their way in. Still, the relief was never enough. For every sack of flour that entered, dozens died in the streets from hunger. But without the lake route, the city would have starved completely. Top-secret Soviet files later revealed the enormous scale of this operation. Entire truck brigades were formed solely for the Ladoga route, code-named ice convoys. Some records remained classified for decades, describing the exact losses of men, vehicles, and supplies. In the frozen silence of the lake, engines roared, headlights cut through blizzards, and drivers whispered prayers. This narrow, cracking highway of ice kept the beating heart of Leningrad alive. As hunger consumed the people, the skies above Leningrad rained fire. German artillery surrounded the city, over 700 heavy guns positioned to pound it day and night. From September 1941 to January 1944, the Germans fired more than 150,000 shells into the city. Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb said, "We shall reduce Leningrad to rubble, stone by stone, building by building." Air raids followed. The Luftwaffe struck warehouses, power stations, hospitals, even orphanages. Fires raged through neighborhoods, turning winter nights into hellish infernos. The Soviet civil defense fought desperately. Fire brigades rushed with little water and broken hoses. Citizens formed bucket lines with melted snow, trying to stop flames from devouring entire blocks. But destruction was everywhere. The Badaev food warehouses burned for days, reducing precious supplies to ash. One survivor recalled how the smell of roasted grain filled the city, a cruel reminder of food that could no longer be eaten. A Soviet nurse wrote in her diary, "Bombs fell on our hospital. We carried the wounded into the snow, but many froze before dawn." Factories worked under constant bombardment. The Kirov plant, despite repeated hits, continued producing tanks. Workers hammered steel with frozen hands. Children ran messages between assembly lines and shelters. The Germans tried psychological terror. Loudspeakers blared propaganda. Leaflets dropped from the sky, promising mercy if the city surrendered. A leaflet read, "Leningraders, lay down your arms. Your leaders have abandoned you." But the effect was the opposite. The people, already facing hunger and disease, clung to defiance. They saw surrender as dishonor, worse than death. Top-secret Soviet files later revealed how the NKVD monitored morale during these bombardments. Reports showed that while despair was everywhere, loyalty to the motherland held firm. Executions of deserters were brutal, but rare compared to the scale of suffering. General Zhukov said, "Leningrad will not fall. The more the enemy strikes, the stronger our will becomes." For nearly 900 days, fire and steel fell from the skies, but the city endured, scorched, broken, starving, yet alive. By late 1942, the siege had dragged on for more than a year. Leningrad was still standing, but at a terrible cost. Nearly 1 million civilians had died from hunger, cold, and bombardment. Yet the Red Army was preparing for a counterblow. Stalin knew the city could not be left to die slowly. He ordered repeated offensives to break the German lines. The Volkhov Front and the Leningrad Front launched attack after attack, but the ring held firm. Joseph Stalin said, "We must smash the blockade. We must open a road to Leningrad, no matter the sacrifice." In January 1943, Operation Iskra, Spark, was launched. Soviet armies struck from both sides of Lake Ladoga. Artillery roared. Tanks advanced through snow and forests. Soldiers charged in waves despite massive losses. After weeks of brutal fighting, the Soviet forces finally broke through a narrow corridor along the lake. It was only a few kilometers wide, but it was enough. For the first time in 16 months, trains and trucks could reach the city. General Zhukov said, "The spark has lit the fire. Leningrad will live." The blockade was not fully lifted yet. The Germans still held positions south of the city, but the lifeline restored through Operation Iskra changed everything. Supplies began to flow in greater amounts. Bread rations increased. For the starving survivors, it was the first glimmer of hope in more than a year. Throughout 1943, the Red Army pressed harder. The German Sixth Army had already been destroyed at Stalingrad. The tide of the war was turning. Leningrad was no longer just a city under siege. It was a fortress preparing to strike back. Soviet High Command drafted secret plans, codenamed Operation January Thunder. The goal: to push the Germans far from the city and end the siege once and for all. Marshal Leonid Govorov said, "We will not stop at breaking the blockade. We will drive the enemy from Leningrad's gates." And in January 1944, nearly 2.5 years after the siege began, the Red Army launched its decisive assault. Artillery barrages thundered for hours, shaking the frozen earth. Waves of infantry and tanks surged forward, smashing through German defenses. By the end of the month, the blockade of Leningrad was finally broken. The German Army Group North was driven back. The ring shattered. The city, scarred, starving, but unbowed, was free again. When the blockade was lifted in January 1944, the people of Leningrad emerged from the ruins, but victory came at a staggering cost. Historians estimate that more than 1 million civilians perished during the siege, most from starvation, disease, and the freezing cold. Entire families vanished. Entire neighborhoods were left in silence. Winston Churchill said, "Leningrad stood alone against unparalleled suffering, and its courage will be remembered as long as men tell tales of valor." The scars of the siege remained everywhere. Mass graves filled the outskirts of the city. Children orphaned. Survivors haunted by memories of hunger, fire, and death. Yet the spirit of the city endured. Factories reopened. Theaters and schools slowly came back to life. And every year, the people of Leningrad remembered the sacrifice. With parades, with music, with silence. Top-secret Soviet archives, declassified decades later, revealed just how close the city came to collapse. Reports described the desperation, the cannibalism, the near-total breakdown of society. But they also documented an iron determination, a refusal to surrender, even in humanity's darkest hour. Marshal Georgy Zhukov said, "The enemy thought starvation would break us, but instead, it forged our strength." For the Soviet Union, the defense of Leningrad became a symbol of resilience. For the world, it was proof of the human will to endure the unendurable. But the cost was immeasurable. 1 million lives, frozen in time, sacrificed so that one city could stand. And now, what do you think? Did the survival of Leningrad save the Soviet Union and perhaps the world? Or was it a tragedy too great, a price too high for victory?